Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting some sort of semi-abstract mountains. I'm going to be using plastic food wrap or cling film to create the special effects of the foreground mountains. And also I'm going to talk a bit about how important I think it is to experiment with your art. I'm using my Koh-i-Noor 5.6mm 2B clutch pencil just to draw in some rough imaginary mountain ranges, just to give me some guidelines for when the paint goes on. I'm going to try a little bit of wax resist. I'm using a white candle here, and I'm just going to draw a little bit with the end of the candle just to transfer some wax onto the paper. Not too much, but just enough, hopefully, to give me a little bit of resistance. And it just might give me a nice effect across the mountains. I'm using Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper. It's £90 weight and it's taped to my board, and my board's at an angle of about 45 to 60 degrees as usual. The paper isn't pre-stretched. I don't pre-stretch. I find that it buckles a bit as I paint, but as it dries it completely flattens. Now I'm using my large Chinese haki brush to wet the paper all over to start with. I want to use the wet in wet technique to start with and build up a layer of fairly thick rich paint across the page so that I can then use my plastic food wrap to create some interesting effects. It's an experiment, so we just have to see what happens. This is just Paynes grey and sepia, but I need a richer mixture, so I've dried off my brush a little bit so there's less water in it, and now I'm going into freshly squeezed out tube consistency Paynes grey and sepia, and I'm just going to put plenty of rich paint roughly over the marks, the lines that I've drawn in for the mountain ranges. It's wet, of course, because we wet the paper first, so it's all diffusing out quite nicely. Gravity is helping it to run downwards as well. So really this is just to see what happens when we add lots of paint, wet in wet, onto the page, and then use the cling film to see if we can create these special effects. Let's just zoom in a little bit closer. I think you can see that we've got a little bit of resistance from the wax lines that I placed across there, so it's not really showing that much, but we've got something there. Let's see if we still have it, see if it still remains once we've made some lovely marks with the cling film. Now I'm just going to use, it's just a generic roll of food wrapping cling film, and I'm going to struggle with it as I usually do, and try and get some out, keeping it nice and flat. And I'm going to lay the cling film across this foreground, the marks of where I drew in like the foreground range, and I'm just going to place the cling film against the wet paint, and it kind of clings in sort of sharp wrinkles like this. So I'm just going to pull it around a little bit just to try and follow the line of my mountain, and it's creating these kind of shard-like patterns where the paint is being pulled into the gaps between the wrinkles where the cling film is touching the page, if you see what I mean. And if I leave that to dry and don't mess around with it too much, hopefully we'll get some beautiful patterns. I'm going to put another piece over this side, over here on the left, a smaller piece. Just do exactly the same. Try and pull the sort of creases into the shapes of mountain strata. Make any little adjustments quite quickly so that you don't disturb the paint too much. Now I think I'm more or less happy with that. It's sort of loosely covering the area that I penciled in. So I'm now going to leave that to dry. The idea is that once the paint has fully dried, then the patterns left on the paper will be very similar to the patterns that you can see at the moment with the plastic against the paint. I think I'm just going to try and get a bit more texture in the upper part of the mountains where there isn't any cling film, and I'm going to use some clean water and my stiff small bristle brush. I'm just going to spatter a few water drops into that area, and hopefully it'll cause some little blooms or blossoms or cauliflowers, and should add to the texture there. So that's it for that stage. I'm now going to dry it flat and let it completely dry. Now it's been drying for a couple of hours and it is completely dry, so I'm going to carefully pull off all the cling film or food wrap and remove it from the painting, and as expected it's dried back an awful lot lighter than it looked before the cling wrap went on and before it all dried. So now I have to look carefully at it and decide what to do next. I really love the effect. It looks like sort of ice or snow or rocky strata, that sort of thing, but I think I need to work on it a little bit more just to pull the painting together. I need to put some dark into the foreground first, so what I'm going to do is take some quite rich Paynes grey and my flat brush, and I'm just going to work between the marks that the cling film has given me. So I'm just going to slowly work up in this shallow diagonal direction from the bottom right corner. I'm going to work up towards that slightly darker patch near the middle. Just sort of dotting and dashing and putting in lines, softening back in places so that I've got hard edges and soft edges, but just trying to bring this mountain together so that the contrasts and the tones in this bottom corner and across the foreground match up a bit better with the dark tones that I've got in my distant mountain. I'm going to work this same way across the whole of this cling film area, leaving some parts as they are, but adding a bit of sepia to the Paynes grey mixture and just working across until I feel that the painting is more balanced. I highly recommend experimenting and playing around like this when you paint sometimes, not necessarily trying to go for a finished painting every time, but just seeing what happens, seeing what happens if I do this or what happens if I do that. I mean, it doesn't matter if it all goes wrong, especially if you're experimenting on the back of an old painting or something like that, but you can just learn so much and just think to yourself, I really like that effect, and it's something that you can then repeat in other paintings and your painting can really progress in a very exciting way. So I highly recommend experimenting on a regular basis, and that's the best way to find out unique and different things that watercolour can do for you. Now I'm just running a few more of these sort of darker strata marks in through this, it's going slightly higher up this mountain range here. Again, trying to just keep a balance of darks and lights, soft and hard edges. Just trying to really enjoy having a sort of connection, a connected pattern here, if you know what I mean. I think I'm just going to come over to this other side, just going to work a little bit more. I'm going to work up this smaller ridge. Just going to use some slightly more diluted paint across this area to keep it a little bit lighter, a little bit paler. Trying to be careful not to overdo it. I sometimes like to just use the squirrel mop brush just to soften back certain areas, just to blur them out a little bit more, so it's not all too hard edged, because the marks with the flat brush can often be fairly hard edged, although I'm quite enjoying that kind of look at the moment, but do need to soften out some of the areas. I need to have some very small marks, some fine marks, but also some larger, more blurry, softer areas. Now I think that's okay for the foreground. Now I'm going to try and define the shape of these background mountains a bit more using this very diluted mixture. It's very weak, diluted mixture of, again, sepia and Payne's grey, and my small calligraphy brush, and I'm just roughly going over the outline that I drew earlier. And then dipping the brush into water, thinning the paint out even more, so that I get a sort of an uneven coverage over that area, so it looks like sort of misty, distant mountains. I'm going to do exactly the same across the top here, but this time I want to work towards this peak being quite a bit darker right on the left side. So I'm working with my diluted paint first, wetting the paper, and then dipping in with darker paint, which then is diffusing into the wet paper and into the paler paint unevenly, and just giving me these lovely sort of stratory effects. Got variation in my tones and my textures. I'm going to come down quite carefully down this edge because I want to keep this edge of this mountain a little bit paler. I'm going to darken in across this side a bit more because of course the paper's still wet, so any paint that I put in there that's nice and fairly rich will just diffuse, and gravity will just take it down the page a little bit and just give me these lovely soft passages of different tones and textures. I think that contrasts quite well against the very sort of hard edge of the mountain peak against the plain sky. And these details I think also serve to connect the foreground with the background, so there's similar sort of shapes but more blurry, if you see what I mean, even though this area hasn't been covered with the cling film to create those sorts of patterns. By introducing a little bit of this very pale patterning, misty patterning towards the back, it links the distant mountains with the foreground peaks. Dropping in a little bit more dark across this edge here, so that this part of this main mountain just stands out from the mistier peak behind. Now I'm nearly there, so I'm just balancing the painting as far as I can see. It's how I want it to look. I'm going to darken up across this edge a little bit more and then soften it with water. And then I think just a bit of, just going to darken up a few areas across the very foreground, just a little bit more, this time with some lamp black, just to get a nice amount of shadow and shade in the very foreground. And I think that's finished as a semi-abstract mountain range. I'm very pleased with that. I'm quite surprised at how effective the cling film was. Now pulling off the tape to reveal the nice clean white border is revealing some lovely clean edges to these mountains as they go off out of the frame. I'm extremely pleased with this actually for a special effects painting. I think it actually looks, some of the rocks actually look surprisingly realistic, like sort of cold, frosty, misty mountains. Well, I hope you'll try out cling film or plastic food wrap in your paintings at some point. Experiment with it and see what sort of effects you can get using different colours and different sort of designs or ideas. It's so much fun to experiment, and you never know what sort of techniques you're going to stumble across or what effects that you're going to discover. And as I say, it can be so much fun. As always, thanks so much for watching, and thanks so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. I'll see you again soon. Take care, stay safe, and happy painting. Bye.